knowing less really can be more. How many times you come out of an exam hall and you've got those right mugs who say that it was really easy, they probably got 100%, and then you or other people say, oh, that was really difficult, I'm not sure if I've even got one. And it turns out that the people who said they did really well actually did quite badly, and people who thought they did badly actually did really well. Well, one of the reasons for this is the Dunning-Krueger effect. So what is this then? Well, it was coined by David Dunning and Dunning-Krueger in 1999, and without boring you with all the details, it essentially explains this graph here. On the vertical axis is perceived intelligence, i.e. how intelligent someone thinks they are, while on the horizontal axis is how intelligent someone really is, or how competent they are. In the experiment, they looked at various attributes and tested candidates on humour, grammar and logic, and after completing the task, they then asked the participants to say how well they think they did in those tasks. What they found came out looking like this. Ultimately, it was found that those who bum-licked themselves and said they were really good actually, more commonly than not, were below the average, and those who are harsher and more self-critical tended to do far better and above average. So let's try and explain this graph. Rather than looking at what happened in a short-term task like the one that Dunning and Krueger did, I think it's far easier to explain this when looking at someone starting a new hobby. As you can see on the graph, when someone starts something new, their confidence quickly grows. They start to learn more and more and more, but the key thing is they don't know how much there is to know. They keep learning content, but they assume that the threshold for knowledge, the roof for how much they can learn, is getting closer and closer. There's a very finite extent to the subject, and so therefore what they already know is actually quite a big bulk of what there is to know entirely. Maybe I would illustrate it something like this. They know a small speck of a small knowledge base. What this pit is a realisation of what the student doesn't know. They continue to learn in their subject, yes, and they become better, but they also realise how much more they will have to know eventually. They start to appreciate actually how much there is to know and the gulf there is in someone who's just starting out and someone who's further along the journey. And now all of a sudden, the entire knowledge base of their subject is no longer that small square we saw a moment ago, which they knew a speck of. Instead, it's this almost infinite expansiveness of knowledge, of which they only know an even smaller proportion. So even though they actually do know more and they're better in the subject because they've worked at it for longer, they realise how much more there is that they don't know, and suddenly it feels like they know hardly anything at all in comparison to this. Maybe their knowledge base looks something like this. Becoming acutely aware of how much there is to eventually know is why people often perceive themselves as being lower performing, because they realise and they focus on the things they didn't know rather than the things they did know. I think to follow this arc all the way through, I think a very good example is chess. I'm a bit of a chess sneak, I'll admit it, but when I first started out, I thought I was the bee's knees. I started off and eventually I reached the dizzying heights of 800 ELO, and I thought I was on the way to becoming Grandmaster. Obviously, it turns out I wasn't, because as I started to consume more content and watch more stuff, I realised that I was nothing in comparison to people who've been playing for years before me, and that I never would be. I would be just as worthless at chess as I was at that moment in time. And so initially I went on this spike of believing I was very good and I had a very quick learning rate, and then suddenly I reached that pit of despair where I began to realise actually I'm nothing in comparison to everyone else, and then suddenly I realised actually I'm being better than most other people at the game as time went on. Eventually there's significantly less of a gulf between your perceived knowledge and your actual knowledge, because you can become better at judging the two. When you distill it, there's a clear association between being self-critical and being able to evaluate yourself and being successful in an endeavour of your choice. If you can actually work on being accurate at self-evaluating, you can realise areas you really need to work on, rather than kind of deluding yourself into believing you're better at something than you really are, or being hypercritical and dumbing yourself down to a level which you're not at. Coming full circle then, I think we can kind of explain this whole thing of the exams. The people that come out of them and say they did incredibly well and think they got 100% and full of confidence, oftentimes the reason for this belief, this false belief, is because they can't evaluate themselves well enough. They can't hone in on the areas they really didn't do well on, and instead they choose to look at the areas that they did do well on. What this means is that while they may be looking at the 10 marks that they know they got for certain, they choose to ignore the 70 that they didn't know as well. Someone else who's maybe higher performing instead may look at it and zoom in on the 30 marks they didn't get, but will decide to look at every other mark that they didn't. As a result, you can see why there's this clear difference in attitude and outlook on an exam paper that causes people to reflect on it differently, despite objectively doing very well or very badly. So in preparation for exams, or in preparation for anything you choose to do, it's important to work out where you sit on that scale currently, where you sit on this Dunning-Krueger trajectory, as it were, and work out what can you do to shift that and to actually make your self-evaluation more constructive, rather than being this tool that either works for or against you. It's also important to ignore everyone else though when coming out on an exam. Like, you really don't need to listen to people who say they did really well, because it's probably quite meaningless. Everyone is so terrible at judging themselves that there's no point in comparing yourself to others who can't even compare themselves with themselves. I mean, delusions of grandeur are one thing, but delusions of failure are equally as damaging. So you don't really know how you did until you have the final results in your hand. So until then, don't try and bait yourself into thinking one thing that's not true, and actually just try and use your evaluation as a cause for good. If you're not good at evaluating yourself still, this is why turning to people who are better at the subject is so good. People who actually decide to ask for help when they need it are going to be more successful, not because they can memorise all the answers, but because they're able to recognise what they need help with, rather than deciding to try and just push it to one side. By asking advice from a mentor or a teacher, inevitably you're going to be able to work out exactly what it is you don't know, and you're going to become increasingly better at pinpointing the specific area that you're not sure of. It's really not a weakness, because you can use it to plug bits of knowledge that you don't have, and you can use it to then improve on the areas you do. So while the paper doesn't explain everything, I certainly think the Dunning-Krueger effect can be used for good to try and explain this kind of gulf between people's perceived ability and their actual ability. I think it really highlights, if nothing else, the association between being self-critical and evaluating oneself and being able to succeed in anything you choose. There's really no point in comparing yourself to how others say they did, because they probably don't even know themselves. And if you can get to a point where you really do know how well you did, then your evaluations will be far better and far more valuable than if you go through these weeks of worrying without actually understanding how well you did. I hope therefore that from this you can remember why people who aren't as intelligent as yourself think they may be. In the back of your mind you can try and recall this and remember why maybe that's not quite the case.